On the surface, St. Rosalind Academy was a sanctuary of music and manners, but beneath the polished floors and centuries-old portraits, it hid a truth so dark, so intricately buried, that it had cost 2 women their lives, and nearly erased the innocence of a third. What happens when silence becomes the deadliest accomplice, and the past decides it won't stay buried any longer? It was on a bleak and rain-smeared Thursday morning in late March that I found myself summoned once again to the side of the incomparable Hercule Poirot. The fire crackled softly in his well-ordered flat at Whitehaven Mansions, casting golden light across the polished parquet floor, as he sat with his fingers steepled and his gaze fixed on a letter spread before him with deliberate care. The air held the faint scent of lavender polish, and Miss Lemon's lemon biscuits, but Poirot's attention was riveted elsewhere. "Ah, mon ami Hastings," he said without glancing up. "You are as punctual as ever. Come, sit. We may have the makings of something curious." His voice held that familiar undertone, a subtle thrill I had come to associate with impending mystery. I took the proffered cup of cocoa from Miss Lemon and glanced toward the open letter. "Another murder?" I asked lightly, though Poirot only raised a brow. "Mais non, not yet, but something is amiss, I think. This comes from Lady Winthrop. Perhaps you recall her from the matter of the vanished tiara at Bath. No? Never mind. She is now chairwoman of the board at St. Augustine's College for Young Ladies, an exclusive finishing school buried deep in the Hampshire countryside. Lady Winthrop suspects something unsettling." He tapped the page gently. "She writes of a sudden tension among the staff, whispers of missing items, and the recent appointment of a certain Miss Eloan Drake as the new instructor of piano and composition. A talented woman by all accounts, but ever since her arrival, the head mistress, Miss Genevieve Holloway, has become withdrawn, fretful, and according to Lady Winthrop, not quite herself." I frowned. Odd behavior, but surely not criminal. Poirot's mustache twitched knowingly. "Ah, but Hastings, where there is shadow, there may be substance. A change in atmosphere, vague unease. It is these small things that herald something greater. Lady Winthrop invites me under the pretense of delivering a lecture on the psychology of detection, but she hopes I shall observe what lies beneath." And so, 2 mornings later, we found ourselves aboard the southbound train, the countryside rolling by in grey and green blurs, as Poirot pored over a dossier prepared by Miss Lemon. "Augustine's," he murmured. "Established in 1862, renowned for producing poised young ladies destined for nobility and diplomacy. Miss Holloway, the head mistress, reputed to be stern but fair. A recent benefactor's wing was added in January. Interesting timing." As the train hissed to a halt at the ivy-choked station, we were met by a tall woman with pinched features and eyes like winter glass. "Miss Danvers," she said crisply. "I am the secretary. The head mistress is occupied, but I shall show you around." The school itself was a looming Gothic affair with narrow windows, looming gables, and long echoing corridors, where girls in navy uniforms moved silently like whispers in a cathedral. Despite the order, a peculiar tension clung to the air, like a stage just before the curtain rises. "That is Miss Drake," Poirot whispered suddenly, and I turned to see a slender figure moving swiftly down a corridor, arms full of sheet music, her eyes lowered. There was nothing outwardly sinister about her, yet something in the rigidity of her movements, the way she avoided all eye contact, prickled the skin. Poirot watched her not with suspicion, but with intense interest, as though trying to decipher a melody only he could hear. Around us, staff members glanced our way, and quickly looked aside, and more than once I caught snatches of hurried conversation falling abruptly silent as we approached. There was a veil here, not of secrecy alone, but of fear, brittle and taut. Whatever dark undercurrent flowed through St. Augustine's, I could feel it gathering like a storm just beyond sight, and by the look in Poirot's eyes, he could feel it too. As the antique oak doors of Ravenwood Academy creaked open, a chill swept through the marbled foyer, where portraits of stoic-faced headmistresses gazed down in solemn silence. The school's Gothic architecture loomed with a sense of age-old secrets, its echoing halls lined with accolades, and faded group photos, labeled with years long gone. "Our Hall of Legacy," murmured Mrs. Kettering, the stern-faced secretary, her voice as crisp as her pressed uniform. "Notable alumnae, retired deans, and moments of distinction. But as we proceeded, a peculiar interruption froze the moment. Miss Alara Duval, a tall pale woman with the gait of a spectre, stepped from a shadowed corridor, and passed silently behind us, only to halt abruptly in front of a photograph. Her eyes locked on the image, as her expression flickered, an unguarded flash of something raw, haunted, grief, recognition. Before the emotion fully surfaced, her mask of composure snapped back into place, and she glided away, without a word. Poirot, who had been unusually quiet, whispered, "Très curieux." We were then guided to a richly furnished drawing room, with heavy drapes, and an air of refined austerity. Tea was served with silver precision, and Poirot, never missing a detail, inquired casually, "Miss Duval, how long has she been among your staff?" Mrs. Kettering hesitated, her eyes flickering. "Only since the autumn term, came from a girls' college in Belgium, impeccable references, and the headmistress, pleased with her performance." The silence that followed was brief but telling. Miss Aldwych is thorough in her choices. With a tight nod, she excused herself. Left alone, Poirot paced slowly, scrutinizing every detail. The choice of books, the arrangement of furniture, the dust on the mantel. "Tradition clings tightly here," I noted, glancing at the antique trophies. Before he could reply, the silence shattered, a piercing scream that seemed to ricochet off the stone walls. Poirot was already moving. We followed the sound through twisting corridors toward the chapel, the echo growing louder with every step. A crowd had gathered, students whispering in terror as one young girl sobbed uncontrollably by the arched doorway. Inside, beneath the stained glass depiction of Saint Cecilia, lay the lifeless form of Miss Aldwych slumped over the pipe organ, her silver bun unraveled and streaked with blood. A slip of paper was pinned to her chest, its message chilling. "They shall reap what was sown in silence." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his breath still. "Do not disturb the scene," he instructed calmly, waving off a flustered teacher. He knelt by the body, studying the tilt of the head, the curve of the fingers. One hand collapsed at her side, the other still pressing a dissonant chord on the keys. "Not fear," he murmured, "but shock." Then he pointed. A teacup, shattered on the floor near the bench, its floral pattern soaked by a pale liquid. "Smell, Hastings." I leaned in. "Almond." "Yes," he said gravely. "Bitter almond cyanide perhaps." Yet, he hesitated, brow furrowed. "Something conflicts." Before he could finish, the chapel doors swung open, and Inspector Harrow strode in, his face set in grim determination. But even his commanding presence couldn't dispel the rising dread that clung to the air like incense. A message of vengeance had been delivered, not just to a woman but to the school itself, and whatever lay buried in Ravenwood's hallowed halls was beginning to stir. Summoned with almost uncanny promptness, Poirot removed his hat with quiet gravity, and offered a slight nod. "Well, well," he murmured, eyes scanning the somber surroundings. "Lady Westholme telephoned me personally, said you were already on the premises and might have insights. Remarkably convenient timing." I arched a brow, but Poirot, unbothered, gestured toward the chapel. "Convenient for the investigation, yes, not however, for poor Miss Thornfield." His voice dropped with solemnity. "You understand, mon ami. I was merely here to give a lecture on the architecture of monastic Europe. This tragedy, it was not anticipated, nor welcome." Inspector Graves nodded curtly, already flipping through his notes. "Right then, what are we dealing with?" "Poisoning almost certainly," Poirot replied without hesitation. "There's the unmistakable scent of bitter almond cyanide, though we mustn't leap. Several other substances produce similar olfactory signatures. I strongly recommend a meticulous post-mortem." As the police photographer clicked and catalogued, Poirot's gaze shifted, drawn not to the body, but to the organ's music stand. "Curious," he murmured, fingertips brushing the sheet music. "Abide with me." "A funeral hymn," I noted. "Indeed," he agreed, though today was not a funeral service, merely the afternoon prayers. "And yet, observe the pages are aligned with excessive precision, a mind for detail." Meanwhile, Graves' men had begun interviewing staff and students. Snippets reached us: shock, confusion, and the repeated claim Miss Thornfield had no enemies. Yet in the headmistress's study, as Poirot moved silently across the elegant chamber lined with aged books and shadows, he noted aloud the symmetry, the pens placed just so, the papers aligned to impossible angles. She prized order, our victim, he said. And when one prizes order, chaos leaves fingerprints. Graves joined us then. Her secretary Mrs. Danvers says she was reviewing student files for hours yesterday. Current students? I asked. That's the strange bit, Graves replied. Records from 15 years ago, no clue why. Poirot's eyes glinted. Ah, the past. It has a habit of whispering back when least expected. Our inquiries led us to Mrs. Danvers herself, stoic, efficient, but her voice wavered as she recalled, Miss Thornfield always took her tea in the chapel, played the organ for exactly 30 minutes each afternoon. Her ritual, her solitude. Any recent changes in her demeanor? Poirot asked. A pause. Since term began, yes. She seemed distracted. Perhaps since Miss Blackwood's arrival. At the name, a flicker of something passed across her face, uncertainty, or fear. I couldn't say. Miss Thornfield never shared personal concerns with me. When Miss Blackwood entered, I studied her keenly. Graceful, composed, but her clasped hands were trembling ever so slightly. A dreadful matter, she murmured. You're new to the school? Graves asked. Yes, Inspector. I arrived 6 weeks ago. Where were you before? I taught music at the Institut Mont Blanc, in Switzerland. Poirot, who had been silently studying a crystal paperweight, looked up. Switzerland. Ah, a country of both beauty and secrets. You are Swiss? No, sir. English. Though I lived abroad for many years, her voice faltered slightly. And your family? A shadow passed over her features. None to speak of. My mother passed away early. I was raised by distant relatives. My condolences, mademoiselle, Poirot said gently. Tell me, had you ever met Miss Thornfield before your appointment? No, monsieur. Everything was handled through correspondence. My references were impeccable. Her eyes lowered then. She was a demanding employer. Precise, but fair. There was something in her tone, something withheld, something trembling just beneath the surface. And in that silence, I felt it, that unmistakable tension, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, and the truth, long buried, was stirring once more. She ruled with firmness, yes, but it was the kind that commanded respect, not rebellion. Demanding, meticulous, and fiercely principled, she was never unkind. I had no quarrel with her methods. In fact, many of us secretly admired the precision with which she ran Cecilia son. Where were you yesterday afternoon? Came the inspector's calm inquiry, each word weighted with implication. Not in the chapel, I presume. No, Inspector, I replied, voice steady. I was in the music room, preparing for tomorrow's choral. The East Wing. The explanation seemed to satisfy him, at least momentarily. Once I exited, Poirot, now alone, turned back toward the desk, like a watchmaker, returning to a delicate mechanism. One drawer at a time, he moved with that measured grace, the quiet hum of thought pulsing behind his eyes. And then in the final drawer, beneath a nondescript stack of administrative records, he stopped. His fingers brushed against a peculiar object, a photograph, torn crudely down the middle, its edges jagged like a wound. Poirot lifted it delicately, holding it to the light as though it might whisper its secrets to him. Ah, he breathed, soft and sharp all at once. Regard this, Hastings. It was a girl, no older than 16, with striking features, sharp cheekbones, intelligent eyes, and a mouth caught between defiance and sorrow. There was an uncanny resemblance to Miss Blackwood. Turning it over, we found a chilling inscription, inked in firm, almost judicial script. Case closed. God have mercy. The message sent a shiver down my spine. Poirot and I locked eyes, the same unspoken question forming between us like mist on a cold pane. But before a word could be uttered, the door creaked. A housemaid, returning to her duties, noticed what we held. What's that? she asked cautiously, eyes flicking toward the torn image. Poirot opened his mouth, but at that moment, a sharp knock echoed through the room. A uniformed constable stepped in, urgency etched into his expression. "Inspector," he said. "Brief quick. We've found something new in the victim's appointment book." She had scheduled a meeting for tomorrow, with a doctor partly, from the Lausanne Sanitarium in Switzerland. "We confirmed it. He arrived in England 3 days ago, and is staying at the Grand Royal." Poirot's eyes flashed with sudden clarity, that familiar glint that meant his mind had started weaving the scattered threads into a coherent tapestry that only he could yet see. The following morning, I arrived at St.
Cecilia,
summoned by his telegram, its language terse and uncharacteristically urgent. The school felt transformed, a cathedral of whispered and watching eyes. The halls once filled with idle chatter, now pulsed with quiet speculation. Students moved in hushed groups, whispering behind trembling hands, while teachers floated like ghosts from one corridor to another, clinging to order as if discipline could hold grief at bay. In the visitors' parlor, Poirot greeted me with that electric glint that always heralded the beginning of revelation. "Mon ami, you came swiftly. Bon, we have much to discuss." "Your message made it clear," I said. "The matter is grave." "Grave," he echoed, leaning closer. "Non, Hastings, it is labyrinthine. The post-mortem confirms poison, but not simple cyanide, as the almond scent suggested. No, this is far more complex, rare, sophisticated. A compound not easily obtained, nor easily traced." "So suspects?" I asked. His expression turned philosophical. "Suspects, my dear Hastings. Everyone is a suspect. In such closed environments, truths hide behind tradition. Secrets here grow roots, twist beneath the surface like vines in the dark." As we walked, he shared his deductions. In a corridor lined with classrooms, a group of solemn-faced girls emerged, their footsteps oddly synchronized, their eyes wary. "The governors insist the routine must go on," he said. "Structure soothes, or so they believe." Then Poirot's gaze fixed sharply on a tall girl in a navy blue uniform, her bearing too composed, her gaze too still. "That one," he said quietly. "She was singled out yesterday during choir, a small error in pitch, nothing more." Yet Miss Thornfield rebuked her harshly. Miss Blackwood was there too, watching closely. Witnesses said her expression was unusually intense. We obtained permission to interview a handful of students in a spare classroom. Their answers were clipped, polite, careful. When asked about Miss Thornfield, their sentiments were nearly unanimous: respect, but not affection. "She was strict," one student, Catherine Hargreaves, told us, adjusting her collar nervously. "Fair mostly. But lately she'd seemed distracted. Edgy. As if something was pressing on her mind." Her voice trailed off, uncertain whether she'd said too much. Poirot's silence grew heavier, his thoughts turning like clockwork. Something told me this school, cloaked in discipline and tradition, was hiding a much darker harmony. One in which every note was out of tune, and someone, somewhere, was orchestrating a far more sinister composition. "Different how, precisely?" murmured Mademoiselle Dupont, her voice light yet probing, each word curling through the air like smoke searching for cracks. The girl fidgeted, adjusting her thick spectacles with a nervous twitch. "Sometimes she just stares," she whispered. "Not angry. More like, she's trying to recall something. Like Catherine was a memory she couldn't place." A soft voice broke in from the cluster of students, Evelyn Porter, the timid one with the mousy demeanor and eyes too large for her face. "But Miss Blackwood's always been kind." That day when Miss Thornfield yelled at Catherine during Panis Angelicus's, she paused, glancing around nervously. "Miss Blackwood found her after and said her voice was beautiful. Told her not to let it shake her." Dupont's eyes shimmered with interest, the kind of gleam that meant she had latched onto something beneath the surface. "This incident, it occurred during choir practice." Catherine nodded. "Last Thursday afternoon, Miss Thornfield just barged in unannounced. She said I'd ruined the school's reputation over one wrong note. She's never been that cruel before." As our interviews ended, DuPont motioned silently for me to follow. Her heels clicked with precision down the marble corridor toward the administrative wing. Headmaster Ashcroft has returned to London, she informed me softly. But not without purpose. Dr. Hartley of the Lausanne Sanitarium, he is not here by coincidence. Miss Thornfield requested details about a former patient. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, quite telling, don't you think? We passed the chapel, its doors now chained and marked by police tape, before slipping through a covered stone walkway toward a detached annex. The music wing, she announced. Let us see the sanctuary Miss Blackwood held dear. The room inside was silent, vast and echoing. A grand piano stood center stage beneath tall, arching windows. Light spilled in from the gardens beyond, casting soft shadows across shelves filled with meticulously arranged sheet music. Composer portraits lined the walls like silent sentinels. DuPont moved with elegant precision, scanning every corner. Note the symmetry, she murmured. The polished keys, the untouched dust. She values order, as did her superior. She paused before a shelf, running a finger along its edge. Curious, she muttered. Nestled among music theory texts were worn tomes on botany, pages marked, some even annotated. Unusual for a music teacher, I offered. Perhaps not so, she replied. The curious mind often wanders, but not without reason. A soft footfall broke the moment. We turned. Miss Blackwood stood in the doorway, her eyes widening ever so slightly. Forgive the intrusion, DuPont offered smoothly. Captain Hastings is new to these grounds. Of course, Miss Blackwood said, her voice calm, though a subtle tremor betrayed her poise. I just came to fetch today's lesson. She moved to the piano, unlocking a hidden compartment beneath the keys. As she withdrew several sheets of music, her fingers, graceful though they were, trembled faintly. DuPont stepped closer. You return to teaching so soon. Music can heal, she replied gently. Even now, with a polite nod, she gathered her portfolio and left, her scent lingering. An odd mix of lavender and something bitter, unplaceable. DuPont stared after her, eyes narrowed in thought. Then she turned back to the piano, flipping open the lid with a subtle flourish. Let us see what melody soothes the soul of our enigmatic music mistress. On the stand, Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor. DuPont seated herself and played a few notes, fingers surprisingly deft. Beautiful, I muttered. Familiar, yet. Her hands moved, reshaping the melody into something simpler, more haunting. A lullaby, ancient and fragile, woven with something sadder than sorrow. My mother sang it to me, she said softly. A tune for forgotten things. We were interrupted again, this time by Inspector Ravensby, a file thick in hand. You were right, DuPont, he said grimly. Lausanne wasn't just a name. Miss Thornfield asked them about someone once declared unfit, someone who may now walk these halls once more. As a dense mist rolled over the cliffs surrounding St. Victoria's Conservatory for Girls, the world seemed suspended in a breathless hush, as though nature itself sensed the reawakening of a long-buried horror. The sprawling Gothic structure, once echoing with the delicate strains of nocturnes and the laughter of youth, now stood solemn and cold, its stone face streaked with time and secrets. It was here that Inspector Armand Vale arrived under the veil of early dawn, summoned not by official channels, but through a cryptic, unsigned telegram, bearing only 6 words. The music never truly stopped. Clutched in his gloved hand was a photograph of a girl long forgotten by public memory. Vivienne Cross, the prodigy, whose fall from grace 15 years ago had been as swift as it was merciless. Her name had vanished from school registries, her reputation dissolved in rumors of theft and psychosis, and her final days, spent in seclusion within a private asylum nestled deep in the Cotswolds, were reduced to silence. But now, with the sudden unexplained poisoning of Lady Halbert, the current headmistress, found dead in her office, with the scent of bitter almonds clinging to the air, the past was clawing its way into the present with terrifying urgency. As Vale stepped inside the dimly lit chapel at the heart of the campus, the hollow echo of his footsteps led him to an ancient organ, its pipes tarnished with age. Behind a false panel, recently disturbed, he uncovered a bundle of delicate artifacts, yellowed newspaper clippings, handwritten notes marked with desperate underlining, and a torn diary entry ending mid-sentence.
They know I found it, they won't.
With this Vale and his companion, the astute and emotionally grounded Dr. Charles Marlowe, set off through winding coastal roads drenched in fog toward a reclusive estate shrouded in ivy, where Miss Iris Delaney, once the school's revered deputy head, now lived in voluntary exile. Her eyes, sharp yet tired, betrayed a flicker of dread when Vale uttered Vivienne's name, an echo from the past she clearly hoped to outrun. Vivienne wasn't mad, she whispered after a pause, so heavy it nearly cracked the room in half. She was brilliant, and she knew too much. The inspector pressed further, peeling back layers of buried animosities, forbidden rivalries, and a haunting composition, an original symphony Vivienne had unearthed, rumored to be cursed, whose melody induced hallucinations and despair in those who dared to perform it. But why would anyone kill to bury it again after all these years? Who among the surviving faculty and alumni feared its resurfacing so deeply that they'd kill to keep the past dead? As Vale examined an old class photo on Delaney's mantel, he noticed a curious figure standing in the shadowy background, face partially turned, unmarked, unnamed, a ghost in plain sight. The answers lay not just in uncovering who had betrayed Vivienne Cross, but in understanding why the music had stopped, and what forces were at play now to ensure it never began again. As a storm brewed over the sea and thunder rolled in the distance, Vale realized that the case ahead was no longer about justice alone. It was a descent into the psychological underworld of obsession, envy and secrets powerful enough to destroy lives even from beyond the grave. It was after the Academy's winter recital, when applause still echoed faintly through the grand stone halls and the scent of old books mixed with melted candle wax, that the storm inside St. Eloin's truly began. The disappearance of Lady Ainsworth's sapphire-studded hairpin, a piece said to be cursed by generations of whispered scandal, sent ripples of suspicion across the dormitories like frost spreading over glass. All eyes turned to Isabel Harrington, a pale introspective girl with a voice that trembled like wind in cathedral windows. Miss Dalloway, a watchful librarian known more for her silence than her compassion, claimed she saw Isabel slip quietly from the headmistress's office late that night, her footsteps light, her face unreadable. The next morning, under her neatly made bed, an empty jewel box was found, its velvet interior seeming to echo with accusation. "But you doubted it," Inspector Renaud said, voice barely above a whisper. Miss Greaves, the former vice principal, stared out the window, her knuckles white against the teacup. Isabel wasn't like that. Her family was unconventional, yes. Her father hosted seances, spoke in riddles, and withdrew after her mother's sudden death. But she was a good girl, fragile, brilliant, lost. And she denied it, again and again with tears like someone drowning in their own truth. Yet Miss Alara, the rigid and reputation-obsessed headmistress, was swift and absolute. The governors feared scandal, and Alara, she always feared shadows that threatened her legacy, Greaves murmured. After the expulsion, Isabel's descent was quick, a breakdown that left her hollow-eyed and silent. Her father, surrounded by allegations of financial impropriety, refused to support her, and she was quietly sent away to the Rosenwald Sanitarium in Austria, a place wrapped in pine trees and secrecy. The same sanitarium, Renaud interjected, where Miss Alara arranged a meeting with Dr. Elias Kreutz only a day before she was found dead. Miss Greaves turned to him slowly, the color draining from her face. "How could you know that?" Renaud didn't answer directly. "And if I told you a new language instructor, Miss Evelyn Crane, has recently arrived from Vienna, fluent in 5 dialects, emotionally distant, yet somehow too familiar, would that mean anything?" Greaves swallowed. "It can't be. Isabel would be nearly 40. This woman is so young." "Unless," Renaud said, leaning in, "she isn't Isabel, but her daughter." Greaves stared into her lap. "There were rumors that Isabel was expecting. We didn't know for certain. She disappeared before anything could be confirmed. But servants talk. They always do." Before leaving, she passed him an old photo, a group of girls lined up in front of the chapel, with Isabel off to the side, half turned away, her eyes intense and unreadable. Later, in their motor car, delayed by a mechanical issue in a nameless village, Renaud examined the image under magnification. Look here, Hastings. The eyes, the jawline. Evelyn Crane carries that same haunted defiance. By the time they returned to the academy, dusk had swallowed the horizon, and the old halls seemed to breathe with the ghosts of unspoken truths. Hastings entered his room to find the inspector's neatly filed documents subtly disturbed, as if someone had studied them and replaced them with too much care. But more chilling was the folded paper left precisely on his pillow, unmarked, save for one line in tightly measured script: "The sins of the past are never silent." Hastings hurried to find Renaud already on the telephone, his voice low and urgent. As Hastings entered, the inspector looked up, eyes gleaming not with fear, but with certainty. "The game has begun," he said softly. "And the past, it's no longer content to stay buried." As soon as I entered the room, Poirot looked up, his face carved with seriousness, brows furrowed, as though he'd just uncovered something deeply unsettling. He held up a finger while speaking into the telephone, his voice low and precise. "One moment," he said calmly, then covered the mouthpiece and turned to me, his eyes sharpening. "What is it, Hastings? You seem disturbed." Without a word, I handed him the note I had received. He unfolded it, scanned the contents quickly, and the flicker of curiosity in his gaze deepened into suspicion. He returned to the receiver. "Inspector, one final question. The death certificate of Catherine Sinclair. Have you seen it with your own eyes? And the date on it?" He nodded slowly at the response, thanked the inspector, and gently placed the receiver down. When he turned back to me, his entire demeanor had changed, a storm of thoughts gathering behind his usually controlled expression. "Hastings," he said slowly, almost reverently, "according to official records, Catherine Sinclair died 10 years ago at a Swiss asylum. Consumption, they say, but something is not right." He reached for the death certificate that had been faxed to the school earlier that day, and pointed to a barely noticeable inconsistency, the tiniest misalignment in the typeface of a single letter. "This," he whispered, tapping the anomaly with his finger, "is not original. My little gray cells are certain. The document has been altered. Flawlessly done, yes, but altered nonetheless." The following morning, Poirot was restless, his mind clearly racing ahead of us all. He paced the room with nervous energy, pausing only to adjust his perfectly waxed moustache in the mirror. "We must observe, Hastings," he said firmly. "There will be time for questions later. First we gather impressions. This afternoon, there is to be a small gathering in the drawing room. Lady Westholme has kindly arranged it, something to calm the school's nerves. But for us, it is an opportunity." "An opportunity for what?" I asked. He turned with a faint smile. "Observation, mon ami, always observation." That afternoon, tea was served with elegant ceremony, but the atmosphere in the drawing room was strangely subdued. Polite conversation floated on the surface, but underneath it all, unease simmered. Poirot, despite his short stature and foreign manner, moved with remarkable ease through the room, exchanging pleasantries and watching every detail like a hawk. I stationed myself near the tea service, discreetly doing my part. Most guests prepared their tea in typical English fashion: milk, sugar, stir. But then I noticed Miss Blackwood. She added a slice of lemon, stirred in honey precisely 3 times, and placed the spoon on the saucer with exactness. It struck me, it was the very method Miss Thornfield used. That evening, I reported this to Poirot. His eyes sparkled. "Excellent, Hastings. You see what I see. This is not a coincidence. This precise style of tea preparation is uncommon here, yet both Miss Thornfield and Miss Blackwood share it. And Blackwood claims she never knew her. Either she is lying or the influence came long ago from someone who wanted to imitate Miss Thornfield down to the finest detail." A silence fell between us, then Poirot added, "We must inspect her quarters, quietly, tonight." "But surely the inspector—" I began. "No, Hastings. The police require proper cause and paperwork. We only need to confirm a theory." And so, as dinner was served and staff were occupied, we crept toward the teacher's wing. I felt uneasy, but Poirot looked completely at ease, even producing a small, elegant set of lockpicks. A gift from an old friend, he said with a smile. Inside, Miss Blackwood's room was tidy to the point of sterility. No clutter, no chaos, just a sterile perfection. Poirot scanned everything, his gaze dissecting the room in a way only he could. And then, as he gently opened an old violin case resting atop the wardrobe, a tiny object slipped from inside and landed on the floor. A small worn leather diary. He picked it up carefully and opened it. Inside, an inscription read, "To dearest Kay, may your music never fade from me." Poirot stared at the page, then looked at me. In that moment I understood. We had stepped into the shadow of something far deeper and far more dangerous than either of us had anticipated. Poirot's gaze, sharp as a blade honed over decades of unraveling human deceit, swept across the dimly lit room, pausing on seemingly mundane details that to him spoke volumes. An antique metronome ticking softly on the mantel, a faint scent of lavender masking something sharper beneath, and a bookshelf that instantly struck one as unusual for a music teacher. Nestled between volumes of Bach and Beethoven were thick, time-worn texts on botany, their spines faded but titles still legible. Pharmacopoeia of the Highlands, Toxic Flora of the Mediterranean, and most notably, Botanical Compounds and Their Properties. With unspoken intent, Poirot drew out the last volume, flipping through its delicate pages until his finger stopped at a heavily annotated section detailing plant-based poisons, their subtle symptoms, delayed effects and difficulty in post-mortem detection. "Most enlightening," he murmured. Beneath her wardrobe, tucked beneath immaculately folded garments, we unearthed a modest wooden box, aged unassuming, inside of which lay an assortment of dried plants sealed in parchment, each labeled in an elegant, steady hand. Belladonna, hemlock, monkshood. Poirot handled them with gloved fingers, his eyes narrowing not with alarm, but with interest, as if he were piecing together an old melody heard once in youth and long forgotten. But it was in the writing desk's bottom drawer that the silence of the room truly began to crackle. Beneath carefully stacked correspondence and the quiet sadness of sheet music sat a small leather-bound journal, its cover worn but its clasp intact. Poirot opened it gently, pages brittle with age, and his expression turned grave as he read. "Look, Hastings," he whispered, indicating a timeline, institutions listed meticulously, positions held, dates, cities, but here a peculiar blank, 3 years unaccounted for. "And this gap," he continued, "matches precisely the time when Catherine Sinclair was said to have been released from Lausanne Sanitarium. She wasn't dead, Hastings. She was healed. The death certificate, falsified. The records fabricated. And 3 years later she re-emerges, not as Catherine Sinclair, but as Miss Eleanor Blackwood, complete with forged references and a reputation built on shadows." The air in the room felt colder. We returned everything to its exact place, the weight of revelation pressing heavy against our backs as we departed in silence. Later, as the somber hush of dinner enveloped the hall, a telegram arrived. Urgent, minimal and devastating. Sinclair child confirmed. Swiss asylum. Adopted by maternal Aunt Harrison. More details to follow. Poirot's eyes flashed with that rare glint of both sorrow and vindication. "The child survived," he said quietly. "But who raised her, and for what purpose?" That night, a memorial service was held in the secondary chapel, the main one sealed under Scotland Yard's watch. Miss Blackwood was asked to play the organ, a position of reverence and exposure. Her fingers danced with flawless control across the keys, the music precise, almost mechanical, and her expression a mask of restrained grace. But as Lady Westhollam rose to deliver a eulogy praising Miss Thornfield's legacy of discipline and devotion, a flicker passed over Blackwood's face, a subtle shiver, a momentary loss of rhythm that only the most observant might notice. Then came "Abide with Me," the same hymn that had been open at the organ during the murder. And just then, an elderly man entered quietly, his frame hunched yet dignified. his suit threadbare but cared for. He slipped into the back row without drawing attention, but Miss Blackwood saw him. And in that fleeting moment their eyes locked, her facade shattered. The music faltered, her hands trembled. A storm of unspoken emotion, shock, fear, recognition, flashed across her face before she abruptly stood, turned and walked away, leaving the final chord suspended in an aching, unresolved silence that clung to the chapel walls like smoke. The man was gone moments later, lost in the confusion. "Hastings," Poirot whispered, voice low and taut with anticipation. "She knows something. Or perhaps she remembers everything." We searched the school in haste, chasing shadows through dim corridors, until Poirot's instinct led us to the music room, where, bathed in moonlight, Miss Blackwood sat alone at the piano, her back to us, playing a slow, melancholic lullaby. Her fingers moved not with performance but memory, every note steeped in pain, each chord a whisper of a life lost, identities buried, and a truth that refused to remain silent any longer. Even before Poirot spoke, he had noticed the pale tension that Miss Blackwood tried so valiantly to conceal, her fingers hovering above the organ keys like suspended thought. "The gentleman at the memorial," Poirot began without preamble, his tone calm but probing. "You recognized him, did you not?" Miss Blackwood froze, her fingers falling still as if the music itself had been abruptly silenced. Slowly she turned to face us, her expression unreadable, her voice low and brittle. "Thomas Wilkins," she whispered. "He was the gardener here. When she faltered, the rest of her sentence swallowed by a sudden gust of wind that rattled the tall windows of the music room, like a warning from another world. Her hands, once so sure, now trembled lightly on the keys. A storm was rising, not just outside the ancient walls of St. Cecilia's, but within them as well, something long buried beginning to stir. By dawn, Poirot was already immaculately dressed, his routine completed with clinical precision, while I joined him at breakfast to find his mind already racing. "We must locate this Thomas Wilkins without delay," he announced, dabbing his lips with a napkin as though the matter were as simple as a misplaced teaspoon. Surprisingly, the search did not prove difficult. A village post mistress, thoroughly charmed by Poirot's continental courtesy, revealed that Wilkins resided in a modest cottage at the edge of the commons. We found the house exactly as described, humble but exacting, its garden a testament to years of attentive care. Wilkins answered the door himself, tall, wiry, with the calloused hands of a man who has spent a lifetime coaxing secrets from the soil, and eyes that had clearly seen far more than they'd ever spoken of. "I figured you'd come," he said, stepping aside without surprise. "Saw you with the police yesterday." The interior was sparse, orderly, every object placed with quiet deliberation, framed botanical sketches, gardening tools hanging like relics above the hearth. "You attended the memorial?" Poirot asked. Wilkins nodded. "Wanted to see her." The resemblance, uncanny. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Miss Blackwood, that's not her real name, is it?" Wilkins murmured. "She's Catherine's daughter, has her hands, pianist's hands, same grace, same fire." He spoke of Catherine Sinclair with a reverence that made the air seem heavier. "She was kind, different, played chess with me in the gardens when no one was watching. A mind like lightning." Then his face darkened. "They said she stole that brooch, but I know what I saw." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "After the spring concert, I was trimming ivy near Miss Thornfield's office. The window was open. It was a warm night. I saw Miss Thornfield herself take that diamond brooch and slip it into her desk. Next day, it's missing, and Catherine's being dragged through the mud. Funny how the brooch was magically found in her room." Poirot's expression turned sharp. "And no one believed you?" Wilkins snorted bitterly. "Who listens to a gardener?" By the time I even heard she'd been accused, it was too late. With quiet deliberation, he retrieved a tin box from the mantel and handed Poirot a yellowed clipping. "This was printed 3 months before they expelled her." It was an old financial column, easy to miss, unless one knew what to look for. Among the list of failed investment names was Harold Sinclair, Catherine's father. Miss Thornfield invested heavily, Wilkins said. Lost a fortune when Sinclair's company collapsed. I know she framed Catherine out of spite. The school paid her off quietly to protect their reputation, but the truth, it never dies. It just waits. And when Poirot asked softly, "And Mrs. Danvers, the secretary, was she involved too?" Wilkins' eyes glinted as he slowly nodded, as if remembering more than he dared to say aloud. During those long and buried years, she had become nothing less than a shadow molded in the likeness of Miss Thornfield, her creation through and through, trained to emulate her composure, echo her tone, and carry out her decisions without question. And as Wilkins finally admitted with a quiet tremble in his voice, it was almost certainly she who had orchestrated the entire deception, carefully planted the jewel case, and turned justice into a mockery cloaked in duty. As we stepped away from the gardener's weathered cottage, Poirot lingered at the threshold, turning slowly back, his voice low but deliberate, a note of sadness buried beneath the calm. "One last question, Mr. Wilkins. The child, Catherine's child. You knew of her." The old man's shoulders sagged, and something fragile cracked behind his tired eyes. "She wrote me once," he whispered, voice breaking, "from that wretched asylum. Said they'd taken the baby away, handed her to her mother's sister, begged me to find her, to at least know she was safe." He looked away, bitter regret heavy on his tongue. "I tried, I did, but they were gone, left for Switzerland. After that, nothing." The silence lingered even as the wind picked up, and it followed us back to St. Cecilia's, where storm clouds seemed to gather not just above us but within every corridor we crossed. Inspector Marlowe awaited us, a folder in his hand, his expression grim as he disclosed the truth. Catherine Sinclair had been released from the Lausanne Sanitarium in 1921, her death certificate. A forgery, common at the time, he said. A discreet way to spare families the shame of mental illness. And the child? Poirot's voice pierced the quiet like a blade. "A daughter," Marlowe replied, "born in 1927. Adopted by Catherine's aunt, Margaret Harrison. They lived in Switzerland until the aunt's death, roughly the same time a young woman by the name of Eleanora Blackwood began taking up teaching posts at various girls'. Each position short-lived," Poirot added, "each move carefully calculated, until she arrived here, at St. Cecilia's. To confront Thornfield?" I asked. "Or to seek retribution," Marlowe said grimly. But Poirot remained pensive, his brows drawn in contemplation. "There is something misaligned, a detail that does not sit comfortably with me. The psychology, it is not entirely right." He said no more, for at that moment, Lady Westholme entered, her face a mask of control and disdain, her voice demanding, "Monsieur Poirot, I understand you've been dredging up ancient scandals. I insist on knowing what relevance Catherine Sinclair has to the tragic murder of dear Abella." Poirot inclined his head with gracious calm. "In due time, Lady Westholme. But tell me, you were on the board during the Sinclair incident, were you not?" "I was," she replied stiffly, "though I left the matter in Miss Thornfield's hands. She was thorough, efficient." "And you approved of her methods?" he asked. Her eyes narrowed. "St. Cecilia's reputation is not to be tarnished." Arabella understood that more than anyone. After she departed, Poirot led us to the music room, where Eleanora Blackwood sat alone, framed in the fading light, her pen suspended above an unfinished letter. "Miss Blackwood," Poirot said softly. "Or should I say, Miss Sinclair?" She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his, calm and fearless. "My legal name is Eleanora Blackwood," she said, "but my birth name was Eleanora Sinclair Harrison. Catherine Sinclair was my mother." "And who sent you here?" I asked. "No one," she answered, her voice quiet but steady. "After my aunt died, I discovered my mother's diaries among her belongings. Her pain, her madness, her desperation, it was all there in ink and heartbreak. I had to come. I had to understand. I had to face the place that destroyed her." "By becoming a teacher here?" Poirot asked gently. "By standing in the very halls that cast her out?" "Yes," she nodded, voice cracking. "And by looking the woman who did it in the eye. I didn't come for revenge. I came for truth, for her memory, for justice." "And Miss Thornfield?" Poirot pressed. She knew me immediately, Eleanora said, swallowing hard. Said I had my mother's eyes. She wasn't angry, she was haunted. She said she wanted to make amends, to tell the truth. But now she's gone. Marlowe stepped in from the shadows. And poisoned, he said coldly, with a substance described in your books. I didn't kill her, Eleanora said, her voice rising. Yes, I confronted her. Alone. She was remorseful. She said it was time to right a wrong. She even offered to speak publicly. How convenient, Marlowe muttered. Now that she's dead, and you're left with only her ghost as witness. But Poirot said nothing. He only studied Eleanora's face, his eyes deep with understanding, not of guilt or innocence, but of pain inherited, of justice long denied, and of the quiet desperation of a daughter who had come not to destroy the past, but to unearth the truth it had buried alive. The truth, Inspector. Whatever you think of me, know this: I am not a murderer, Miss Blackwood whispered, her voice taut, trembling at the edges, yet her eyes burned with an eerie calm, defying the weight of the accusation. The room fell into a heavy silence, each person caught in the thick fog of uncertainty. But the night brought no respite. Hours later, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the desolate corridors of the academy as a maid stumbled upon Mrs. Danvers' lifeless form sprawled unnaturally on the cold stone floor of the archive room, her expression frozen in a look of terror, her hand clutching the edge of a filing cabinet, as if trying to anchor herself to life. She had been poisoned eerily, in the exact same way as Miss Thornfield. Another Bible verse pinned crudely to her clothing read, "The sins of the fathers shall be visited upon the children." The implication was unmistakable. Within moments Inspector Hargrave gave the command to arrest Miss Blackwood, his voice sharp with certainty, though Poirot remained unusually quiet, his brows knitted with unspoken concern. 2 murders, same toxin, same message, both victims tied to her mother's disgrace. What more do you need? Hargrave insisted. And yet as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Miss Blackwood, her face ashen yet composed with an almost haunting dignity, turned to Poirot and murmured, "The Beethoven sheet music." Miss Thornfield's desk read the margins. The urgency in her voice stirred something in him. Hours later, under dim light and heavy silence, Poirot and Hastings examined the music sheet, old, smudged but revealing when tilted just right. Faint pencil marks emerged like whispers from the dead. Assembled in sequence, they spelled out a fragmented warning: Harrison child must reveal truth, danger. But the final word had been violently erased, as though someone feared it might speak too loudly. Poirot sat in deep thought the next morning, pacing the drawing room in a storm of agitation. "It is too convenient," he muttered. "Everything points to her because someone wants it to." Hastings, seated with brows furrowed, argued, "But the evidence is damning. Botanical texts on rare poisons found in her room, the exact toxin used in both murders. Planted," Poirot said softly. "Tell me, would a careful killer really keep such obvious evidence so close? No, mon ami, this is too neat, too theatrical. She could have written the warning herself, then erased the name to mislead us," Hastings suggested. Poirot nodded slightly. "Perhaps, but consider this: Miss Thornfield was preparing to come clean, to right the wrong done to Catherine Sinclair. Why would Miss Blackwood silence the one person about to restore her mother's honor? Why wait 15 years only to sabotage justice when it's within reach?" Inspector Hargrave interrupted. "Revenge makes no sense, Poirot. Sometimes it just erupts. But these murders, they require meticulous planning. Yet the evidence is so convenient. Even a novice could follow the trail." Poirot turned sharply. "The poison, did you identify its origin?" Hargrave nodded. "A rare plant extract, nearly impossible to obtain without specialist knowledge. Acts like cyanide but leaves unique botanical markers." "Then this is no crime of passion," Poirot murmured. "This is the hand of someone precise, someone invisible." Later that day, they met Dr. Hartley, a frail, scholarly man recently arrived from Lausanne Sanitarium. He laid a worn folder on the table. "Miss Sinclair was admitted suffering from deep melancholia," he explained, his voice carrying both compassion and regret. "She was broken, accused, pregnant, alone. But over 3 years she recovered. Remarkably so, especially after giving birth. Her daughter was her light, her anchor. But when the child turned 2, her aunt took custody. It was mutual, but difficult. Poirot's gaze hardened. Something was still missing, something just out of reach, concealed beneath layers of lies and silence. And as he stared at the fading records, the image grew clearer, not of a lone murderer, but of a buried legacy, carefully rewritten over the years. The murders were not just revenge, they were part of a puzzle left unsolved for too long. And the final piece, he feared, had been deliberately erased. Catherine Everleigh had always known that if she was to ever reclaim her dignity and rewrite the course of her life, she would have to step away from the institution that had once branded her with silence and shadows. But the question lingered, did she ever truly succeed? Dr. Hartley, with a solemn nod, confirmed that she had indeed managed to establish herself quietly, securing a modest role in the administrative office of the sanitarium, where she spent years working with diligence and discretion, never attracting attention, never revealing her past. Then one day, she vanished. No records, no forwarding address. A death certificate, falsified at her aunt's insistence, conveniently erased her existence from public record. A not uncommon tactic employed by families, desperate to avoid the shame associated with mental illness. So you believe Catherine Everleigh might still be alive? I asked. The doctor's face clouded with discomfort. Technically, yes, but I haven't seen her since the spring of 1921. That revelation clung to us like a chill. Poirot, ever restless when details whispered secrets, next visited the school laboratory. There, among Miss Blackwood's possessions, was a small glass vial with clear liquid remnants, and an elegant handwritten label, specimen. Fascinating, Poirot murmured, lifting it gently to his nose. No almond scent, and yet the symptoms mirror cyanide poisoning. I recalled the tea spilled beside Miss Thornfield's rigid body, and said it might have been the method. Perhaps, Poirot said, eyes narrowing. But recall Hastings. The tea did carry a bitter almond aroma, yet this specimen does not. Curious, no. His attention shifted to the lab requisition records, where things took a stranger turn. None of the listed chemicals had been requested by Miss Blackwood. The names signed were that of Miss Porter, the science instructor, and Lady West, the school's principal benefactor and overseer of unusual supplies. Poirot requested a private audience with Lady West that same afternoon, and I accompanied him to her grand private quarters, which looked more like a stately manor drawing room than something belonging to a school. You don't seem to be progressing much in solving this unfortunate matter, she said coolly, the faintest tremor in her voice betraying anxiety. The governors are worried, concerned about the school's reputation. Ah, always the reputation, Poirot replied with a sharp glint in his eyes. It seems here at St. Cecilia, his image matters more than integrity. Lady West straightened in her seat, her aristocratic features firm. Miss Thornfield understood that, as do all who value tradition. Poirot's tone shifted, quiet and loaded. As did you, when you supported the unjust expulsion of Catherine Everleigh 15 years ago. That situation had entirely different circumstances, did it? You were fully aware that Miss Thornfield's father had suffered devastating financial losses due to Harold Everleigh's corrupt dealings, were you not? A shadow passed over her eyes. I fail to see the relevance. Oh, but that is the relevance, madame, Poirot said with finality. That was her motive. Miss Thornfield sought revenge on Catherine for her father's ruin, and you, in your position on the board, helped her carry it out. And now, as the past resurfaces, it is Miss Thornfield who lies dead, silenced before she could be exposed. Lady West rose abruptly. I believe we're done here. You overstep. Yet Poirot, calm and unshaken, turned to me once outside and whispered, "Did you see it, Hastings?" Her left hand always hidden under that shawl. She's hiding something. We pressed on to the library, and there Poirot uncovered a startling piece of the puzzle. Old sheets of music, annotated in Miss Thornfield's distinct handwriting. But these weren't mere songs, they were codes. Using a cipher based on musical notation, Poirot translated them into chilling revelations. Miss Thornfield had recognized Eleanor's true identity, and had been wrestling with guilt, preparing to confess the truth. She feared what the past would drag into the light, Poirot said, his fingers gliding over the decoded words. Miss Blackwood's arrival forced a reckoning. But what if Miss Blackwood is not the killer? He paused, thoughtful. Who then stands to lose the most if the truth of Catherine's expulsion is revealed? Who fears exposure? The question hung heavy in the air. Both victims, Miss Thornfield and Eleanor, had discovered the truth. That night Poirot issued formal invitations to every key player. Even Miss Blackwood was granted a temporary release from custody to attend the library gathering. Tomorrow night at precisely 8 p.m., he declared. The fog shall lift and the killer will stand revealed. I retired to my room, my mind tangled in secrets, motives and buried sins. Below, in the flickering firelight of our sitting room, Poirot remained at his desk rearranging notes, symbols and pieces of the past like a man preparing for war. And somehow I knew the end was near, but the danger was far from over. It must have been barely past midnight when a shattering, bone-jarring crash tore through the silence like a gunshot, jerking me upright in bed, heart pounding in my throat. I sprinted across the hallway only to find Poirot's bed utterly destroyed, splinters and shattered crystal scattered across the floor like the aftermath of a war zone. The grand chandelier, which had hung with dignified grace above his room for decades, now lay crumpled in ruin on the wrecked mattress. And Poirot, by what could only be described as a miracle wrapped in razor-edged timing, stood near the dresser clutching his reading glasses, his expression unreadable, save for that faint narrowing of the eyes, a sign I knew meant his little grey cells were already sprinting ahead. "Mon ami," he said softly, brushing dust from his sleeve with eerie composure, "someone is in great haste to prevent the truth from reaching daylight." By dawn, Inspector Graves confirmed that the chandelier's suspension had been tampered with, the chain deliberately filed through. Had Poirot remained in bed mere moments longer, he would have been silenced forever. Later that day, the library of St. Augustine's was arranged with theatrical precision for what Poirot called his final movement. The windows were heavily curtained against the encroaching dusk, casting the room in a velvet darkness broken only by the golden glow of the lamps. The suspects sat like chess pieces arranged before a master, Lady Halbrook, dignified yet tense near the fireplace, Thomas Green, the former groundskeeper, hunched like a cornered animal. Miss Alara Blake, pale and motionless, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. Inspector Graves stood nearby, notebook ready, eyes flickering with doubt and anticipation. Poirot, ever the conductor, had dressed meticulously, his mustache sharper than ever, his tie symmetrical as a blade, his voice calm and clear. "Mes amis," he began, pacing slowly before the assembled, two deaths separated by weeks, but united by motive, by method, and by malice. He recounted the tragedy of the Fenwick scandal, a fabricated theft pinned on a young teacher named Margaret Wills 15 years earlier, an accusation that shattered her reputation and led to her disappearance. "But lies," Poirot said with rising intensity, "they are like seeds. You bury them, yet in time, they grow into thorns." He turned to Alara Blake. "You returned not to avenge but to uncover. Miss Fenwick recognized you the moment you arrived, her face, as you said, drained of color. She offered to speak to the board, to make amends, to clear your mother's name." Alara nodded, her voice a whisper. "She said it was time, that she had been haunted all these years." Poirot's eyes glinted, "And that, you see, posed a dangerous inconvenience. Because if Margaret Wills was innocent, someone else was guilty. Someone who had used the scandal to ascend, financially, socially, politically." His gaze fell finally, on Lady Halbrook. "It was you, madame. You forged the evidence that destroyed her. And when your old accomplice wished to clear her conscience, you silenced her." A gasp rippled through the room and the spell broke. The pieces were in place, the truth unmasked, but the chandelier's fall had been the overture. This was the finale. As the heavy silence settled over the chamber like a storm about to break, the tension thickened with each breath. Lady Aldridge, regal and unyielding, sat with her chin slightly raised until Inspector Moreau's voice sliced through the stillness like a blade. "Speculation, madame. Ideal in evidence, not conjecture. Miss Everleigh left behind more than whispers. She left truth hidden in plain sight." He reached into his coat and withdrew a sheet of aged parchment, its edges singed and curling, as he turned to face the seated board of St. Augustine's conservatory. A coded message concealed within her concerto manuscript, cleverly embedded in the notations, revealed the identity of the very person she feared. Someone who stood to lose not just reputation, but everything if the truth saw daylight. Moreau's gaze locked on Lady Aldridge. "You weren't just a benefactor, were you? You orchestrated the expulsion of Lenora Blake, to bury an embezzlement scandal." Miss Everleigh was ready to confess how she siphoned thousands from the school's endowment and funneled it into your failing estate projects. And she wasn't acting alone. Lady Aldridge's face remained marble-like, though her gloved left hand twitched beneath the folds of her shawl. "These ledgers," Moreau continued, unfolding brittle documents, "show large disbursements labeled as archival preservation expenses, money that ended up in offshore accounts linked to your family trust. Transactions approved quietly after Lenora's expulsion, all masked as departmental grants." Chancellor Worthington leaned in, eyes narrowed. "You're implying Lady Aldridge framed a student to hide financial fraud." "Not implying," Moreau corrected, voice steady, stating. "The brooch Lenora was accused of stealing. A red herring planted by Miss Everleigh to divert suspicion. But when Miss Blackwood arrived this semester, Lenora's niece, bearing an uncanny resemblance, the past clawed its way back. Miss Everleigh's guilt ignited, and she intended to make things right. You couldn't let that happen." A flicker of panic crossed Lady Aldridge's face. "The poison," Moreau added grimly, "was no common substance, a compound derived from Stramonium vespera, a nightshade variant native to the Indonesian Isles, where your late husband oversaw colonial exports, combined with a heating agent that mimics cyanide's almond-like scent designed to deceive." Her lips parted in denial, but Moreau raised a hand. "The chemical requisition forms bear your signature requested under the guise of a botanical study, and this," he held up a scorched handkerchief, "found hidden in the incinerator room, bears the residue of that same compound. The same room where your hand was burned last week, wasn't it?" For a heartbeat the room froze. Then, in a flash of motion, Lady Aldridge plunged her hand into her embroidered satchel. "Down!" Worthington roared, but Moreau didn't flinch. "Looking for this?" he asked coolly, holding up the small antique revolver. "Removed this morning, the bullets replaced with wax caps. I learned my lesson after the vial in my tea." Lady Aldridge stood trembling, her mask shattered. "I built this place. Its reputation, its legacy, mine." Everleigh swore she'd take the secret to her grave. Then that girl arrived, stirring ghosts. And Margaret, always prying, threatening to expose it all after Everleigh's death. "I paid her off, but she wanted more, always more." The weight of decades crumbled in her words as Officer Keene stepped forward with cuffs gleaming. The conservatory's vaulted ceiling seemed to press downward, the truth finally dragging its secrets into the light. As Inspector Raynaud escorted Lady Ashcroft out of the Grand Library, her once regal posture now bent beneath the weight of disgrace, her eyes stripped of their usual aristocratic coolness and burning instead with the fire of exposed guilt. Miss Alara stepped toward Detective Mirza, her breath catching somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. "How do I even begin to thank you, sir?" she whispered, voice cracking under the weight of years of buried pain. "You didn't just clear my name, you've given my mother her honor back. After all these years." Mirza offered the faintest of smiles, his gaze steady yet distant, as if still tracing the last ghost of deception that had lingered in the shadows of St. Augustine's scent. "Miss Alara," he said gently, "truth may be silenced, twisted or buried beneath layers of respectability, but it never dies. It waits quietly, for those who dare to listen beyond the noise." That night, the old chapel, usually cloaked in silence and mystery, was gently lit by the flickering warmth of candlelight. Alara sat alone at the piano beneath the stained glass window, her fingers trembling as they found the notes of Elysian Drift, the haunting lullaby her mother once composed while cloistered within the school's hidden gardens. As the melancholy melody drifted into the air, its echoes seemed to trace through the chapel like forgotten memories coming back to life. It was the same melody Mirza had instinctively hummed days ago, the one that had stirred something deep within him, the first invisible thread in a tapestry of long-buried truths. Just before sunrise, as the final note faded into the stone stillness of the chapel, I turned to Mirza as we prepared to leave the school behind. "Tell me," I asked quietly, "how did you truly know that it was Lady Ashcroft?" He paused, adjusting the angle of his coat collar as a soft draft passed through the high arches, then spoke in a low, thoughtful tone. "It wasn't just the poison, that was too theatrical. It was her obsession with order, yet her actions contradicted it. Every time I met her, her teacup sat slightly left of center, a subtle shift, but intentional. Because of the burn on her right hand she could no longer grip with strength. And those gloves, she claimed they were sentimental relics of her husband. But chemical traces on the fingertips told a different story. Ink stains, not age. She'd forged the financial ledgers herself, hiding the money trail leading back to the poisoned foundation funds." He looked up at the glasswork as dawn broke through, painting him momentarily in golden blue. "But it was the music that spoke the loudest. Guilt has a rhythm, patterns in behavior, glances that linger a second too long, melodies that resurface when one believes they're alone. It all becomes part of a greater composition. And if you listen closely enough, you realize, the truth always hums in the background, waiting." As we stepped out into the soft glow of morning, the mist rising from the dewy grounds, and the first sunlight casting long pale shadows across the school's worn stone steps, I felt a strange kind of peace settle over me. A chapter had closed, yes, but more importantly, a lie had unraveled, and beneath it something raw and real had finally been set free. The ivy-covered facade of St. Augustine stood quiet behind us, a monument not just to history, but to the secrets it had once buried. "Truth," Mirza said one last time as we reached the gate, "is never truly gone. It's like a forgotten melody. You just have to listen, and have the courage to recognize its tune." If this case stirred something inside you, if you found yourself holding your breath as the truth peeled away the mask, tell us in the comments below. Were you surprised by Lady Ashcroft's downfall? And if you crave more of Detective Mirza's intricate mysteries and quiet wisdom, hit that subscribe button for a new case every day. Until then, remember his parting words: the melody of truth doesn't vanish. It lingers, soft, subtle and persistent, waiting for someone to finally hear it.